The rumble of tank treads crushing the frozen ground shook Martin awake. He bolted upright, his heart hammering against his ribs. Through the frosted window of his farmhouse, he saw them, 5 massive war machines, their gun barrels aimed directly at his barn. "They found him," Martin whispered, a cold dread washing over him. He grabbed the shotgun leaning against his bedside table and rushed down the creaking stairs. His wife Elena stood at the kitchen window, her face pale with fear. "What did you do, Martin?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the mechanical growl outside. Martin didn't answer. He didn't have time to explain how the wounded soldier he'd hidden in their barn last night had changed everything, how the simple act of mercy might cost them their lives. A voice boomed through a megaphone. "Martin Kavek, we know you're harboring an enemy combatant. Send him out now or we will open fire." Martin's hands trembled as he reached for the door. The soldier in his barn wasn't just any soldier. He was carrying something that could change the course of the war, something both sides would kill to possess. And now Martin had exactly 10 seconds to decide which side of history he would stand on. 24 hours earlier, Martin had been checking his fences as the early winter sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and purple. His breath formed clouds in the frigid air as he hammered a loose post back into the frozen ground. At 52, Martin's body protested the physical labor more each year. His farm had been in the family for 3 generations, surviving wars, droughts, and economic collapse. He wasn't about to let a harsh winter be its downfall. The distant sound of gunfire made him pause. The war had been creeping closer to their remote valley for months. Government bulletins assured citizens they were safe, but the increasing military presence told a different story. "Just stay away from us," Martin muttered, hammering the post with extra force. He was finishing up when he noticed something dark against the white snow near the tree line. At first, he thought it was a wounded animal, but as he approached, the shape revealed itself to be a man in a torn military uniform, face down in the snow. Martin hesitated. Helping soldiers from either side was risky. The government had strict rules about non-interference, and breaking them could mean imprisonment, or worse. The man groaned weakly. Martin cursed under his breath. He couldn't leave someone to freeze to death, soldier or not. He flipped the man over gently. The soldier's face was young, barely 25, with a deep gash across his forehead. His uniform bore no distinctive markings, just plain green fatigue soaked in blood and melted snow. "Hey," Martin shook him gently, "can you hear me?" The soldier's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and dilated with pain. "Don't tell them," he whispered through cracked lips, "please." Martin glanced around nervously. The valley was empty, but for how long? Military patrols had been increasing. "I'm going to help you," Martin said, making a split-second decision he would soon question. "But you need to stay quiet." The soldier nodded weakly as Martin hoisted him up, supporting his weight. The man was surprisingly light, his body radiating an unnatural heat despite the cold. "What's your name?" Martin asked as they stumbled toward the farm. "Daniel," the soldier mumbled, "Daniel Fletcher." "Well, Daniel, I'm Martin, and I hope I don't regret this." By the time they reached the barn, Daniel was barely conscious. Martin laid him on a bed of hay in an empty stall at the back, hidden from sight. "Elena is going to kill me," Martin muttered as he examined Daniel's wounds. Besides the head gash, there was a bullet wound in his left shoulder and what looked like shrapnel damage to his right leg. "Water," Daniel croaked. Martin brought him a canteen and helped him drink. As Daniel gulped desperately, something fell from his jacket onto the hay, a small metal cylinder with a glowing blue light on one end. Daniel's hand shot out with surprising strength, grabbing Martin's wrist. "Don't touch it," he warned, his eyes suddenly clear and intense. "That's why they're hunting me." Martin stared at the device. "What is it?" Daniel's eyes darted around as if checking for eavesdroppers. Something that wasn't supposed to exist, something that could end this war or make it much worse. Before Martin could ask more questions, the barn door opened. Elena stood there, arms crossed, her expression a mixture of anger and concern. "Martin, who are you talking to?" Her words died as she spotted Daniel. "What have you done?" In their 27 years of marriage, Martin had never seen Elena this angry. "Have you lost your mind?" she hissed, packing their kitchen while Martin explained what happened. "There are penalties for harboring soldiers. They could take the farm, Martin. They could take our lives." Martin ran a hand through his graying hair. "What was I supposed to do? Leave him to die?" "Yes, no," Elena sighed, her anger deflating. "I don't know, but this isn't our war." "War comes whether we invite it or not," Martin said quietly. Elena's eyes softened. She knew Martin was thinking of his father, who had died in the last conflict 30 years ago. "What side is he on?" she asked. "I don't know. His uniform has no markings." "A deserter, then?" Martin shook his head. "I don't think so. He's carrying something, some kind of device. He says people are hunting him for it." Elena's face hardened again. "So not only did you bring home a soldier, you brought home a soldier being actively pursued. Martin, we need to turn him in before." A sudden pounding at their front door made them both freeze. Through the window, Martin glimpsed 2 military jeeps parked in their yard. Not the regular army, these were special forces, distinguished by their black uniforms and red shoulder patches. "They're here already," Elena whispered, panic rising in her voice. Martin straightened his shirt. "Act normal, I'll handle this." He opened the door to find a stern-faced officer with captain's bars on his collar. His name tag read VOSS. "Mr. Kovac?" the captain asked, his voice clipped and professional. "Yes," Martin replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm Captain Voss, Special Operations. We're tracking enemy movements in this area." He produced a tablet showing a satellite image of their farm. "Our surveillance detected unusual activity near your property approximately 2 hours ago. Have you noticed anything suspicious?" Martin shook his head. "Nothing unusual, Captain. Just been fixing fences all day." Voss studied Martin's face carefully. "We believe an enemy operative may be in this vicinity, possibly wounded. He's stolen classified military property and is considered extremely dangerous." Martin kept his expression neutral. "Haven't seen anyone, but I'll keep an eye out." Voss didn't seem convinced. "Would you mind if we check your property? Standard procedure." It wasn't a request. "Of course," Martin said, stepping aside. "Though I'm not sure what you expect to find. It's just me and my wife here." Captain Voss gestured to his men, who immediately began searching the house while he continued questioning Martin. Elena stood by nervously, answering when spoken to, her hands fidgeting with her apron. "What kind of farm is this, Mr. Kovac?" Voss asked, examining the family photos on the wall. "Mixed crops and some livestock," Martin answered. "Nothing special." "Been here long?" "All my life. It was my father's farm before mine." Voss nodded thoughtfully. "Difficult to maintain in wartime, I imagine." "We manage." A soldier appeared from upstairs. "House is clear, sir." Voss turned his attention to the window, looking out at the barn. "And that building?" Martin's stomach tightened. "Just the barn, farm equipment, feed a few animals." "I'd like to see it," Voss said, already moving toward the door. Martin followed, exchanging a panicked glance with Elena. They had no choice but to lead the captain across the yard to the barn. As Martin pulled open the heavy wooden door, a strange smell hit him, antiseptic and metallic, not the usual barn smells of hay and animals. Captain Voss noticed it too, his posture immediately tensing. "What do you keep in here, Mr. Kovac?" he asked, hand moving to the holster at his hip. "Like I said, just equipment and..." A sudden noise from the back stall, a soft thud and shuffling, made both men turn. Voss drew his weapon. "Stay behind me, Mr. Kovac." Martin's heart pounded as Voss moved cautiously toward the sound, gun raised. When he reached the stall, he paused, then looked back at Martin with cold fury. "You lied to me," he said. But instead of finding Daniel, Voss was looking at Elena, who stood over an injured fox lying on the hay. "I found him caught in a trap this morning," she explained, somehow keeping her voice steady. "Martin doesn't approve of my rescuing wild animals, so I keep them here without telling him." The fox whimpered, its leg bandaged with what looked like strips of cloth suspiciously similar to a military uniform. Voss lowered his weapon slightly, looking between Elena and the fox with suspicion. "That doesn't explain the smell," he said. Elena pointed to a bottle of veterinary antiseptic nearby. "I'm not a vet, Captain. I do what I can." For a long moment, Voss stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then he holstered his weapon. "Very well," he said finally. "But I strongly advise against lying to military personnel during wartime, Mrs. Kovac. It could be misconstrued as something more serious." "I understand," Elena said, lowering her eyes submissively. "It won't happen again." As they left the barn, Martin caught a glimpse of Daniel's boot barely visible behind a stack of hay bales, just out of Voss's line of sight. The soldier had moved himself deeper into hiding. Outside, Voss issued orders to his men to return to the vehicles. Before leaving, he handed Martin a card. "If you see or hear anything unusual, call this number immediately. It's your duty as a citizen." "Of course," Martin agreed, pocketing the card. As the jeeps pulled away, Elena collapsed against Martin, her body shaking. "They'll be back," she whispered. "I know," Martin said grimly. "We need to get rid of him tonight." When they returned to the barn, Daniel was sitting up against the hay bales, the mysterious device clutched protectively in his hands. His face was pale but determined. "You should have turned me in," he said weakly. Elena glared at him. "That option is still on the table." Martin knelt beside him. "You've put my family in danger. I want to know why. What is that thing and why are they hunting you for it?" Daniel looked down at the cylinder. The blue light pulsed steadily, casting eerie shadows across his face. "It's called a quantum cipher key," he explained. "It can break any encryption instantly. Military communications, government databases, nuclear launch codes, everything becomes accessible." Martin frowned. "You stole it." "No," Daniel said firmly. "I built it. I'm not a soldier, I'm a physicist. They drafted me when the war started, put me to work in their weapons research division." "Which side?" Elena asked. "Who do you work for?" Daniel gave a bitter laugh. "Does it matter? Both sides in this war want the same thing, total control." He held up the device. "This was supposed to be impossible to create. The theoretical models said it couldn't be done, but I found a way." "And now they want it back," Martin concluded. "Both sides want it," Daniel corrected. "I was working for the Eastern Coalition, but the Western Alliance found out what we were developing. There was an attack on our lab. Everyone else was killed. I escaped with the prototype." He leaned forward, wincing in pain. "But I can't let either side have it. This technology, it's too dangerous. It would make the war unwinnable for either side, which means they'd resort to more desperate measures. Millions would die." Martin and Elena exchanged concerned glances. "What's your plan then?" Martin asked. "Where were you going when I found you?" "There's an international scientific outpost in the mountains," Daniel said. "Neutral territory. Scientists there can help me destroy it properly. The blueprints are already gone. I destroyed them before I left." Elena stood up abruptly. "This is insane. You're asking us to hide you from both armies. We'll be killed." "I'll leave tonight," Daniel promised. "I just needed a few hours to rest." Martin shook his head. You can barely walk, and there's a blizzard coming." He pointed to the darkening sky outside. "You'd die before you made it 5 miles." "Better me than your family," Daniel said grimly. The three fell silent, the gravity of their situation settling over them like the approaching storm clouds. Finally, Martin spoke. "One night," he decided. "You can stay until morning. Then we'll figure out how to get you to this outpost without getting us all killed." Elena opened her mouth to protest, then closed it again. She knew that stubborn look in her husband's eyes. "If we're doing this," she said instead, "he needs proper medical attention, and we need to hide that thing better than just shoving it in his pocket." They spent the next hour treating Daniel's wounds properly. The bullet had gone clean through his shoulder, which was lucky. The head wound was superficial, and the leg injury, while painful, hadn't damaged any major blood vessels. As Elena stitched him up with their farm's basic medical supplies, Martin constructed a hiding place for the quantum cipher key. He hollowed out an old book in their library, creating a space that perfectly fit the cylinder. "No one would think to look there," he said, showing Daniel. "Most of the books are so old they're falling apart anyway." As night fell, the promised blizzard arrived. Wind howled around the farmhouse, rattling the windows and driving snow into drifts against the walls. Martin helped Daniel move from the barn to the house, settling him in the small guest room at the back. "The storm might buy us some time," Martin said as he checked the bandages one last time. "No one will be patrolling in this weather." Daniel nodded weakly, already drifting off to sleep. The pain medication Elena had given him was taking effect. "Thank you," he murmured. "Not many people would risk what you're risking." Martin didn't answer. He wasn't sure himself why he was helping this stranger. Maybe it was the memory of his father, who had died trying to remain neutral in a conflict that demanded everyone take sides. Downstairs, Elena was preparing a simple dinner, her movements tight with tension. "We should have a backup plan," she said as Martin entered the kitchen. "Somewhere to go if things go wrong." "My brother's place in the Western Valley," Martin suggested. "It's far enough away that they wouldn't connect us immediately." Elena nodded, but her expression remained troubled. "And if they catch us before we can leave?" Martin had no answer for that. They ate dinner in silence, the howling wind outside filling the void where conversation should have been. After cleaning up, Martin checked all the doors and windows, then set his shotgun by the front door. "Not that it would do much good against military forces," he admitted. "Then why keep it there?" Elena asked. "Makes me feel better," Martin replied with a grim smile. They went to bed early, though neither expected to sleep much. Martin lay awake, listening to the storm and thinking about the strange turn their lives had taken in just a few hours. He must have dozed off eventually because the next thing he knew, something had jolted him awake. A sound different from the storm, mechanical, rhythmic. "Engines." Martin slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Elena, and moved to the window. Through a break in the snow, he saw lights moving on the road leading to their farm. Not the headlights of jeeps this time, something larger, something tracked. "Tanks." His blood ran cold. Captain Voss hadn't believed their story after all. Or maybe he had, but someone higher up had ordered a more thorough search. Martin quickly dressed and crept down the hall to the guest room. Daniel was already awake, sitting up in bed, his face tense with pain and fear. "They're coming," he whispered. "How did they find you?" Martin demanded. Daniel looked away. "The device. It emits a specific energy signature. It's faint, but their equipment can detect it if they're looking specifically for it." "You didn't think to mention this earlier," Martin hissed. "I thought the storm would interfere with their sensors," Daniel protested. "And I didn't think they'd bring this level of firepower. This isn't just the Eastern Coalition anymore. These are Western Alliance forces." Martin cursed. "So now we have both sides coming after us." "Martin," Elena appeared in the doorway, her face pale in the dim light. "What's happening?" Before he could answer, the house shook as something massive rumbled past outside. Through the window, they watched in horror as a tank positioned itself in their yard, its turret rotating toward the house. "They're surrounding us," Martin said, his mouth dry with fear. Daniel struggled to his feet. "I need to go out there, if I surrender myself." "They'll kill you and take the device," Martin cut him off, "and probably us too for helping you." "Then what do we do?" Elena asked, her voice surprisingly steady despite the trembling in her hands. Martin thought quickly. The quantum cipher key was still hidden in the hollowed-out book in their library. If they could somehow get it to this neutral outpost without Daniel. A spotlight suddenly blazed through the window, illuminating the room in harsh white light. Outside, a voice boomed through a megaphone. "Martin Kovac, this is Commander Wells of the Western Alliance Special Operations. We have reason to believe you are harboring an Eastern Coalition agent and stolen military technology. You have 5 minutes to exit your home with your hands visible. Failure to comply will be considered an act of hostility." Martin turned to Elena and Daniel, his decision made. "The root cellar," he said urgently. "There's a tunnel that leads to the old well behind the property line. My grandfather dug it during the last war. It might be our only chance." Elena nodded, already moving to gather essential supplies. "What about the device?" Daniel asked. "I'll get it," Martin assured him. "Now move, we have less than 5 minutes." As Elena helped Daniel toward the hidden trapdoor in the pantry, Martin rushed to the library. The hollowed-out book sat exactly where he'd left it on the 3rd shelf. But when he opened it, his heart stopped. The quantum cipher key was gone. "It's not here," Martin called out, his voice tight with panic as he frantically searched the shelves. "Someone took it." Elena appeared at the library door, her face a mask of confusion. "That's impossible. No one's been in the house except us." Behind her, Daniel leaned heavily against the wall, his face pale with pain and fear. Could Captain Voss have found it when his men searched the house? "No," Martin insisted. "I made the hiding place after they left." A terrible thought struck him. Unless they came back while we were sleeping. The house shook as another tank took position, this one directly in front of their porch. The megaphone voice spoke again. "4 minutes remaining, Mr. Kovac." There was no time to search the entire house. Martin made a split-second decision. "We stick to the plan. Get to the cellar now." They hurried to the pantry where Elena pulled aside a worn rug, revealing a trapdoor. The hinges protested loudly as Martin yanked it open. "It hasn't been used in decades," he explained, revealing a steep ladder descending into darkness. The tunnel might have collapsed in places. "Better buried than shot," Daniel muttered as he began the painful climb down. Elena followed, then Martin, pulling the trapdoor closed above them. The cellar was pitch black and smelled of damp earth and old potatoes. Martin felt around until he found an ancient lantern hanging on a nail. His grandfather's emergency supplies were still there, untouched for 30 years. Remarkably, the lantern still worked, casting weak yellow light around the small space. At the far end, a low archway marked the beginning of the escape tunnel. "It's about 200 yards to the well," Martin explained as they crouched to enter. "Stay close." The tunnel was narrower than Martin remembered from childhood explorations, barely wide enough for an adult to crawl through. The earthen walls were supported by old wooden beams that creaked ominously as they passed. Behind them, muffled by earth and distance, they heard the commander's final warning. 1 minute remaining. They crawled faster, Daniel gritting his teeth against the pain of his wounds. The tunnel sloped gradually upward, the air growing fresher as they approached the exit. Finally, Martin saw moonlight filtering through gaps in the wooden cover above them. They had reached the old well. "Wait," he whispered, handing the lantern to Elena. "Let me check first." He pushed against the rotting wood, creating a small gap to peer through. The well stood in a small clearing about 100 yards beyond the farm's fence line. From this vantage point, he could see his farmhouse surrounded by military vehicles, not just tanks but armored personnel carriers and jeeps as well. As he watched, soldiers began approaching his front door, weapons raised. "Time's up, Kovac," the commander's voice boomed. Martin was about to signal the all-clear when movement at the edge of the clearing caught his eye. He froze, straining to see in the pre-dawn darkness. A figure was moving through the trees toward the well, a familiar figure in a black uniform with red shoulder patches. Captain Voss. And in his hand, glowing faintly blue in the darkness, was the quantum cipher key. Martin ducked back down into the tunnel. "We've got a problem," he whispered. "Captain Voss is out there with the device." "What?" Daniel hissed. "How?" "He must have found it during their search and took it without telling his superiors," Elena realized. "That's why he didn't arrest us immediately. He wanted to sell it himself." Daniel's face hardened. "He's playing both sides, planning to sell it to the highest bidder." A deafening explosion rocked the ground above them. The assault on the farmhouse had begun. "We can't let him get away with it," Daniel said urgently. "If either side gets that technology—" "I know," Martin cut him off. He thought quickly. "The Western forces don't know Voss has it, if we can create a distraction." Elena touched his arm. "Whatever you're planning, it's too dangerous. We need to run while we can." Martin shook his head. "This war has already taken too much from too many. If there's a chance to keep this weapon out of their hands," he made his decision. "I'm going after Voss. You two head east, toward the ridge. There's an old hunting cabin where you can shelter until it's safe to move again." "I'm coming with you," Daniel insisted. "You can barely walk," Martin pointed out. "And you need to get to that outpost. You're the only one who knows how to destroy the device properly." Another explosion shook the ground. Time was running out. "Be careful," Elena whispered, tears in her eyes as she kissed Martin quickly. "Come back to me." Martin nodded, his throat tight. "I will." He helped them out of the well and pointed them toward the distant ridge, barely visible in the pre-dawn light. Then he turned toward where he had seen Captain Voss, drawing the shotgun he had brought from the house. Moving silently through the trees, Martin spotted Voss about 50 yards ahead, speaking urgently into a radio. The quantum cipher key glowed in his pocket, its blue light pulsing faster now, as if sensing the danger around it. Martin raised his shotgun but hesitated. He wasn't a killer, never had been. There had to be another way. Suddenly, the forest behind him erupted with gunfire and shouts. The Western forces had discovered the tunnel. Voss's head snapped up at the commotion. His eyes widened when he spotted Martin aiming the shotgun at him. "Mr. Kovac," he said smoothly, raising his hand slightly, "this isn't what it looks like." "It looks like you stole that device and planned to sell it," Martin said, keeping the shotgun steady despite his trembling hands. Voss's expression hardened. "And what if I did? Do you have any idea what this technology is worth, what it could do in the right hands?" "That's the problem," Martin replied. "There are no right hands for something like that." Voss laughed coldly. How noble, the simple farmer with principles. His hand moved subtly toward his holster. "But principles won't stop this war. Power will, and now power is in my hands." Behind them, soldiers were getting closer, shouting commands as they searched the woods. "Drop your weapon," Martin ordered, "and hand over the device." "Or what?" Voss challenged. "You'll shoot me. I don't think you have it in you, farmer." He was right. Martin had never fired his shotgun at anything but wild animals threatening his livestock. But right now, something much worse than wolves threatened everything he cared about. "Last chance," Martin warned, his finger tightening on the trigger. Voss moved with military precision, drawing his pistol in one fluid motion. Martin fired instinctively. the shotgun's blast deafening in the quiet forest. Voss stumbled backward, his pistol flying from his hand. He wasn't hit directly. The shotgun spread had mostly missed, but the force and surprise had knocked him off balance. Martin rushed forward, slamming the butt of his shotgun into Voss's jaw before the captain could recover. Voss collapsed, dazed but still conscious. The shouting behind them grew louder. Soldiers would be upon them in seconds. Martin reached into Voss's pocket and extracted the quantum cipher key. Its blue light pulsed rapidly now, almost like a heartbeat. "This ends now," Martin said, raising his foot to crush the device. "Wait," Voss gasped, blood trickling from his mouth. "You don't understand what you're doing." "I understand perfectly," Martin replied. "This thing can't exist." As his foot began to descend, a blinding white light suddenly erupted from the device. The blue pulsing accelerated to a solid glow, and a high-pitched whine filled the air. Martin staggered back, shielding his eyes. "What's happening?" "Self-destruct sequence," Voss spat, scrambling away. "It must have detected tampering." The light grew brighter, the whine louder. Martin knew instinctively that whatever was about to happen, he didn't want to be anywhere near it. He turned and ran, charging through the underbrush away from both Voss and the approaching soldiers. Behind him, the whine reached an unbearable pitch, then suddenly stopped. The silence was more terrifying than the noise. Martin glanced back just in time to see a dome of blue energy expanding from where the device had been. It rolled outward like a wave, engulfing trees, rocks, and soldiers in its path, including Captain Voss, whose scream was cut terrifyingly short as the energy passed through him. Martin ran faster than he ever had in his life, lungs burning, legs pumping. But the energy wave was moving faster, gaining on him with each passing second. Just as he felt its heat on his back, Martin dove behind a massive fallen oak tree. The blue wave passed over him, around him, through him. Every nerve in his body felt like it was on fire, then ice cold, then nothing at all. The world went silent and still. When Martin opened his eyes, the forest looked exactly the same. No destruction, no fire, no obvious damage of any kind. But something felt different. The air tasted metallic, and his skin tingled strangely. He stood up cautiously, checking himself for injuries. Nothing seemed broken, though his entire body ached as if he'd been thrown from a horse. In the distance, he could hear shouting, soldiers regrouping, confused by what had happened. He needed to move to find Elena and Daniel before the military forces reorganized. As Martin turned to leave, he noticed something odd about the fallen tree that had sheltered him. Where his hands had gripped the bark, the wood looked different, newer somehow, as if that small section had reverted to a younger state. He didn't have time to puzzle over it. Dawn was breaking, and he needed to reach the ridge before full daylight. Martin began running east, toward where he hoped Elena and Daniel had found safety. As he ran, he couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed, not just in the world around him, but in himself as well. Whatever that energy wave had done, its effects were far from over. And somehow, Martin knew that the strange tingling under his skin was just the beginning. The rumble of tank treads crushing the frozen ground shook Martin awake. He bolted upright, his heart hammering against his ribs. Through the frosted window of his farmhouse, he saw them, 5 massive war machines, their gun barrels aimed directly at his barn. "They found him," Martin whispered, a cold dread washing over him. He grabbed the shotgun leaning against his bedside table and rushed down the creaking stairs. His wife Elena stood at the kitchen window, her face pale with fear. "What did you do, Martin?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the mechanical growl outside. But this time, Martin remembered. This wasn't the first time he'd experienced this moment. Something impossible had happened in those woods. The energy wave from the quantum cipher key had done something to time itself. He was reliving the same day. "Elena," he said urgently, "listen carefully. I know this sounds crazy, but I've already lived through this day once." She stared at him as if he'd lost his mind. "What are you talking about?" "The soldier in the barn. His name is Daniel Fletcher. He's carrying a device called a quantum cipher key that can break any encryption. Both sides want it. Captain Voss from the Eastern Coalition already searched our house yesterday, but Western Alliance forces have found us now." Elena's eyes widened. "Martin, how could you possibly?" The megaphone outside crackled to life. "Martin Kovac, we know you're harboring an enemy combatant. Send him out now, or we will open fire." Martin grabbed Elena's shoulders. "I don't have time to explain everything, but something happened in the forest. The device malfunctioned. I think it's given me a second chance to fix this." Before Elena could respond, Martin was already moving toward the door. "What are you doing?" she called after him. "Changing the ending," he replied grimly. Martin stepped onto his porch, hands raised. 5 tanks formed a semicircle around his property, with dozens of soldiers positioned behind them. Their uniforms bore the blue and white insignia of the Western Alliance. A man in a commander's uniform stood at the center, megaphone in hand. He looked surprised that Martin had emerged so quickly. "I'm Martin Kovac," Martin called out. "I want to speak with whoever's in charge." The commander approached cautiously, flanked by 2 armed guards. His name tag read WLLS. "Commander Wells," Martin said before the man could speak. "I know why you're here. You're looking for Daniel Fletcher and the quantum cipher key." Wells' eyes narrowed. "How do you know that name? That information is classified." "Because Captain Voss from the Eastern Coalition already visited me yesterday," Martin explained. "And I know he's planning to steal the device for himself." This caught Wells off guard. "Voss was here when?" "Yesterday afternoon. He searched my property but didn't find what he was looking for." Martin lowered his voice. "Because I hid it somewhere he couldn't find it." Wells studied Martin carefully. "You expect me to believe you're willingly cooperating after harboring an enemy agent?" "I'm a farmer, not a soldier," Martin said. "I don't want any part of this war. I just want my family to be safe." He gestured toward his house where Elena watched fearfully from the window. "The device is dangerous, too dangerous for either side to have. But I know where it is, and I'll take you to it under one condition." "You're not in a position to negotiate, Mr. Kovac." "Maybe not," Martin conceded. "But I'm offering you a chance to secure the device without bloodshed. Your alternative is to destroy my farm and possibly lose what you came for in the process." Wells considered this, then nodded curtly. "What's your condition?" "Safe passage for my wife and myself to the neutral territory in the mountains. Once we're there, I'll tell you where to find the device." "And the Eastern agent?" Martin hesitated. In his previous experience of this day, Daniel had been willing to die to keep the device from falling into the wrong hands. But Martin had also seen what happened when the device activated its self-destruct sequence, the strange temporal distortion that had somehow sent him back to this moment. What if that wasn't supposed to happen? What if the device could do even worse if mishandled? "Daniel Fletcher isn't just a soldier," Martin said carefully. "He's a physicist who created the device. He knows how to safely deactivate it. Without him, you risk triggering security protocols that could destroy what you're after, or worse." Wells frowned, clearly weighing his options. After a long moment, he gave a curt nod. "Very well. You, your wife, and Fletcher will be transported to the neutral scientific outpost. Once there, Fletcher will deactivate the device under our supervision, and you'll all be granted asylum." "I have your word," Martin pressed. "You have my word as an officer," Wells confirmed. "Now where is Fletcher?" "In the barn," Martin admitted. "But he's badly wounded. He needs medical attention." Wells barked orders, and 2 soldiers with medical kits hurried toward the barn. Others maintained their positions around the property, weapons ready. Elena emerged from the house, confusion and fear battling on her face. "Martin, what have you done?" "Trust me," he whispered as she reached him. "This is our only chance." The soldiers returned from the barn, supporting Daniel between them. His face was gray with pain, but his eyes were alert and questioning as they met Martin's. "I had to make a deal," Martin explained as they brought Daniel closer. "We're going to the scientific outpost, all of us. You'll deactivate the device there." Daniel looked alarmed. "You told them about the device. Martin, you don't understand what could happen if—" "I understand better than you think," Martin cut him off quietly. "I've seen what it can do when it self-destructs. Something happened to time itself." Daniel's eyes widened. "That's impossible. The temporal displacement protocols were theoretical. We never implemented them." "Well, something happened," Martin insisted. "I've already lived through this day once. The device activated some kind of energy wave when Voss tried to take it." "Voss?" Daniel's face darkened. "He's Eastern Coalition. Why would he?" "He's playing both sides," Martin explained quickly, "planning to sell the device to the highest bidder." Before Daniel could respond, Commander Wells approached them. "Enough talking. Where is the device, Kavak?" Martin pointed toward the house. "Hidden in a hollowed-out book in my library, third shelf, red binding." Wells dispatched soldiers to retrieve it, then turned to Daniel. "Dr. Fletcher, I presume, you've caused quite a stir in high command. Both sides want what you've created." Daniel straightened despite his injuries. "Both sides should fear what I've created, Commander. This technology was never meant to exist." "Yet here we are," Wells replied coldly. "You'll deactivate any security protocols during transport. Any attempt to destroy the device will be considered hostile action. Understood?" Daniel nodded reluctantly. The soldiers returned with the hollowed-out book. Inside was the quantum cipher key, its blue light pulsing steadily. Wells examined it with a mixture of awe and caution. "Secure it," he ordered, handing it to a specialist who placed it in a lead-lined case. "Prepare for transport." As they were led toward the waiting vehicles, Elena gripped Martin's arm. "How did you know where it was? I thought you said Voss took it." "He did in the future I experienced," Martin whispered. "But in this timeline it's still where I hid it." Elena looked at him as if he'd gone mad. "Timeline? Martin, you're not making sense." "I know," he admitted, "but right now I need you to trust me." They were loaded into separate armored vehicles, Martin and Elena in one, Daniel and the device in another. As they pulled away from the farm, Martin caught a glimpse of his home, still intact. At least in this version of events, they hadn't destroyed everything he'd built. The convoy traveled swiftly through the valley, taking back roads to avoid potential Eastern Coalition patrols. Inside their vehicle, Martin and Elena sat in silence, guarded by two stoic Western Alliance soldiers. "What happens when we reach this outpost?" Elena finally asked. "I don't know exactly," Martin admitted. "In my previous experience, we never made it there." Elena leaned closer, lowering her voice. "You really believe you've lived through this day before? That's impossible, Martin." "So is a device that can break any encryption in seconds," he countered. "Yet it exists. Daniel said something about temporal displacement protocols. Whatever happened in those woods reset time somehow." "And only you remember." Martin nodded. "Only me." Elena's expression was troubled. "If what you're saying is true, why didn't you just avoid helping Daniel in the first place? We could have turned him in immediately, avoided all this danger." The question hit Martin hard. Why hadn't he chosen a safer path? He could have let the past unfold differently from the start. "Because some things are worth the risk," he said finally. "That device is too dangerous for either side to have, and Daniel deserves a chance to destroy what he created." Their conversation was cut short as the vehicle suddenly lurched to a stop. Shouting erupted outside, followed by the unmistakable sound of gunfire. "Stay down," one of the guards ordered, moving to the window to assess the situation. A massive explosion rocked their vehicle, throwing them against their restraints. Through the small window, Martin saw one of the tanks in their convoy erupting in flames. "Ambush!" someone shouted outside. "Eastern Coalition forces." More explosions followed. The guards rushed out to join the fight, leaving Martin and Elena alone in the armored vehicle. "We need to find Daniel," Martin said urgently, unlocking his restraints. "If either side gets that device." "You said the Western Alliance gave their word," Elena protested. "And I believe Commander Wells meant it," Martin replied. "But if the Eastern Coalition captures us now, all bets are off." They cautiously exited the vehicle into chaos. The convoy had been attacked in a narrow mountain pass, with Eastern Coalition forces firing from elevated positions on both sides. Western Alliance soldiers returned fire while trying to protect the vehicles containing their precious cargo. Martin spotted Daniel being hustled from his transport by Western soldiers, the lead-lined case clutched tightly in the hands of the specialist. They were moving him toward a small bunker built into the mountainside, an emergency shelter for exactly this kind of situation. "There," Martin pointed, pulling Elena down as bullets whizzed overhead. They crawled behind the burning vehicles, using the smoke as cover. Martin's farming instincts, knowing how to stay low in tall grass to avoid being seen by predators, served him well now. They were halfway to the bunker when a new sound cut through the battle noise, the distinctive whop-whop-whop of helicopter rotors. Martin looked up to see 3 Eastern Coalition attack helicopters cresting the ridge. "Run!" he shouted, abandoning stealth for speed. They sprinted the remaining distance, bullets kicking up dirt at their heels. Just as they reached the bunker entrance, the helicopters opened fire, their heavy machine guns tearing through the Western Alliance's remaining vehicles. Inside the bunker, they found Commander Wells directing his forces via radio, his face grim. Daniel sat against a wall, clutching his wounded shoulder, while the specialist worked feverishly on the lead-lined case, which now had a blinking red light on its exterior. "What's happening?" Martin demanded. Wells glared at him. "Your Eastern Coalition friends found us somehow." "They're not my friends," Martin snapped. "What's wrong with the device?" The specialist looked up, panic in his eyes. "It's activating, sir. Security protocols engaging. I can't stop it." Daniel struggled to his feet. "Let me see." Despite Wells' suspicious look, he nodded for the specialist to step aside. Daniel examined the case, then the device inside, his expression growing increasingly alarmed. "The temporal displacement field is initiating," he said. "Someone transmitted an activation code remotely." "Can you stop it?" Wells demanded. Daniel shook his head. "Not without the proper equipment. This is why I was taking it to the scientific outpost. They have the necessary tools to safely deactivate it." "How long do we have?" Martin asked, remembering the blinding light and expanding energy wave from his previous experience. "Minutes, maybe less," Daniel replied grimly. "When it fully activates, I'm not sure what will happen. The theories suggested localized temporal distortions, but if what you experienced is true, the effects could be far more widespread." Outside, the battle raged on. The Eastern Coalition forces were closing in, determined to capture the device at any cost. Commander Wells made a decision. "We need to get the device to the outpost immediately. It's only 5 miles from here through the mountain pass." "We'll never make it through that firefight," the specialist protested. "Not in vehicles, no," Wells agreed. "But there's an old mining tunnel that runs parallel to the pass. It comes out less than a mile from the outpost." Martin exchanged glances with Elena. More tunnels, more narrow escapes, history repeating itself with variations. "I'll take it," Martin volunteered suddenly. Everyone stared at him. "I know these mountains," he explained. "I hunted here as a boy, and I've already experienced what happens when that device activates. Maybe that gives me some kind of, I don't know, immunity." Daniel considered this. Theoretically, someone who's already been exposed to the temporal field might be less affected by subsequent exposures, but it's just a theory. "It's too risky," Wells objected. "You're a civilian." "Which means the Eastern Coalition won't be looking for me," Martin countered. "They'll be focused on capturing you and your soldiers. I can slip through while they're distracted." Wells hesitated, clearly weighing his limited options. "I'm going with him," Daniel said firmly. "I'm the only one who knows how to properly handle the device if it becomes unstable." "Me too," Elena added, gripping Martin's hand. Wells studied the three of them, then nodded reluctantly. "Very well. Johnson will guide you to the tunnel entrance. Once inside, follow it east. You can't get lost. There are no side passages anymore. They collapsed years ago." He handed Martin a small radio. "The outpost's frequency. Call them when you're close and they'll send an escort." The bunker shook as something heavy impacted nearby, likely a tank shell or helicopter rocket. "Go now," Wells ordered. "We'll create a diversion." As they prepared to leave, the specialist transferred the quantum cipher key to a smaller, more portable case. Its blue light was now pulsing rapidly, the rhythm matching Martin's racing heartbeat. "Be careful," the specialist warned, handing the case to Daniel. "It's becoming increasingly unstable." Johnson, a grizzled sergeant with a scarred face, led them to a concealed door at the back of the bunker. It opened onto a narrow path that wound up the mountainside, hidden from view of the battlefield below. "Follow this path 50 yards, Johnson instructed. "You'll see a rock formation shaped like a wolf's head. The tunnel entrance is behind it, hidden by brush. Good luck." They slipped out as Wells organized his remaining forces for a desperate counterattack. The sounds of battle echoed through the mountain pass as they climbed the steep path, Martin supporting Daniel while Elena scouted ahead. They found the wolf-shaped rock exactly where Johnson had described. Behind it, hidden by years of overgrowth, was a dark opening barely large enough for a person to squeeze through. "This must be it," Martin said, pulling aside the brush. Elena produced a small flashlight from her pocket. She had thought to grab emergency supplies before they left the farm. Its beam revealed a narrow tunnel reinforced with old wooden supports, many of which had rotted over time. "Looks stable enough," Martin assessed, though his face betrayed his uncertainty. Daniel checked the case. The pulsing blue light was now almost constant, and a faint humming sound emanated from within. "We need to hurry," he urged. "The temporal field is expanding." They entered the tunnel in single file, Martin first, then Daniel, with Elena bringing up the rear. The passage was cramped and damp, forcing them to hunch over as they walked. Every few minutes, distant explosions from the battle would send dust and small rocks showering down from the ceiling. "How much farther?" Elena asked after they'd been walking for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes. "Hard to say," Martin replied. "These mountains are riddled with old mining tunnels. Some go on for miles." Daniel suddenly stumbled, nearly dropping the case. The device inside emitted a high-pitched whine, similar to what Martin had heard just before the energy wave in his previous experience. "Daniel," Martin turned back, concerned. "It's accelerating," Daniel gasped, his face pale in the flashlight beam. "The temporal displacement field is growing unstable. We need to get to the outpost now." They increased their pace, ignoring the growing pain in their backs from the stooped position. The tunnel began to slope upward, suggesting they were nearing the exit. Just as hope began to rise, a deep rumbling shook the mountain around them. Dust and rocks rained down more heavily. "The battle," Elena guessed. "They must be using heavy artillery." but Martin felt a strange, tingling sensation on his skin, the same feeling he'd experienced in the forest after the energy wave passed through him. It's not the battle, he realized aloud. It's the device. It's affecting time again. As if confirming his words, the air around them seemed to shimmer, like heat rising from sun-baked asphalt. The walls of the tunnel appeared to waver, becoming momentarily transparent before solidifying again. "What's happening?" Elena cried, grabbing onto Martin for support. "Temporal fluctuations," Daniel explained, his scientific mind still functioning despite his evident fear. "The device is creating bubbles of altered time around us." "Altered how?" Martin demanded. Daniel shook his head. "Impossible to predict. Some areas might experience time more quickly, others more slowly. Some might even revert to past states or jump to future ones." Another violent shake threw them against the tunnel walls. Ahead, Martin saw something impossible. A section of the tunnel was rapidly aging before his eyes. The wooden supports crumbled to dust. The rock walls eroded as if centuries were passing in seconds. "Run!" he shouted, pulling Elena forward. "We need to get through before the whole tunnel collapses." They sprinted toward the deteriorating section, Daniel clutching the case to his chest despite his injuries. As they reached the affected area, Martin felt time itself become fluid around him. His movements seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously, one foot taking forever to touch the ground, the next step happening in the blink of an eye. Elena cried out beside him, her voice distorting like a recording played at the wrong speed. Daniel wasn't visible at all, somehow having moved ahead of them despite being in the middle just moments before. They emerged from the temporal distortion to find the tunnel ahead intact but different, newer somehow, as if they had stepped back in time to when the mine was still operational. Fresh timber supported the walls, and old-fashioned mining equipment lined the passage. "This isn't possible," Elena whispered, touching a perfectly preserved pickaxe that should have rusted away decades ago. "The device is reshaping reality around us," Daniel said from ahead, creating pockets of different time frames. Martin noticed something else. Daniel's wounds were gone. His shoulder showed no sign of the bullet hole that had been there minutes ago. "Your injuries," he pointed out. Daniel looked down at himself in surprise. "The temporal field must have reverted my body to a state before I was wounded." He checked the case, his expression darkening. "But the device is still unstable. These effects are temporary and unpredictable." They continued forward, passing through patches of tunnel that shifted between past, present, and what might be future states. In some sections, they saw holographic markers and advanced support systems that hadn't been invented yet. In others, they witnessed the tunnel in various stages of collapse. Finally, they saw daylight ahead, the exit. As they approached, the tunnel stabilized around them, the temporal fluctuations diminishing. "We're getting beyond the device's immediate field of influence," Daniel explained. "But its effects will continue to spread if we don't contain it soon." They emerged onto a forested slope just as the sun was setting, though Martin couldn't be certain if it was the same day or even the same year anymore. The scientific outpost was visible in the valley below, its white buildings gleaming in the fading light. Martin activated the radio Wells had given him. "Scientific outpost, this is Martin Kovac. We have the quantum cipher key and it's becoming unstable. We need immediate assistance." Static answered him for several long seconds. Then a calm, professional voice responded. "Mr. Kovac, this is Dr. Abernathy at Outpost 7. We've been monitoring temporal anomalies in your vicinity. Stay where you are. A retrieval team is already en route to your location." True to the doctor's word, they soon spotted a group of figures in white hazmat suits climbing the slope toward them. Each suit had strange devices attached, temporal stabilizers, Daniel explained, designed to protect the wearer from chronological disruptions. The team reached them quickly, surrounding the case with portable containment equipment. The lead scientist approached Daniel with evident recognition. "Dr. Fletcher," she said, her voice muffled by her helmet, "we thought you were dead after the lab attack." "Nearly was," Daniel replied. "These people saved me." "And the device?" she asked, eyeing the case. "Unstable. The temporal displacement field has activated. We've already experienced significant localized disruptions." She nodded gravely. "We've detected them. They're spreading across the valley. If we don't contain the reaction soon, the effects could become permanent. Isolated pockets of time running at different rates, or worse, complete temporal collapse." "Can you stop it?" Martin asked. "Yes, but we need to get it to our containment chamber immediately." She turned to her team. "Prepare for emergency transport." As the scientists worked to secure the device, Martin noticed something disturbing in the valley below. Where the battle had been raging earlier, there was now an eerie stillness. The entire area was enveloped in a blue haze, within which nothing seemed to move. "What's happening down there?" he asked, pointing. The lead scientist followed his gaze. "Time dilation field. Within that area, time has slowed to near zero. 1 second inside might equal days outside." "The soldiers," Elena began. "Frozen in time," the scientist confirmed, "until we can stabilize the device and reverse the effect." A chill ran down Martin's spine. This was far worse than what he'd experienced in the forest. The device wasn't just sending people back in time, it was fracturing time itself. The containment team finished their preparations, the case now surrounded by a complex array of equipment that emitted a soft humming sound. "We're ready," the lead scientist announced. "Let's move." They descended toward the outpost, the scientists carefully monitoring the equipment surrounding the case. Daniel walked among them, contributing his expertise to their efforts. Martin and Elena followed, still processing the incredible events they'd witnessed. As they neared the outpost, Martin noticed more temporal anomalies, patches of summer flowers blooming in what should be winter, trees that aged and rejuvenated in cycles, and strangest of all, echoes of people who weren't physically present, ghostly figures going about activities that had happened in the past or might happen in the future. The outpost itself seemed protected, surrounded by a dome of energy that kept the temporal distortions at bay. They passed through a decontamination chamber before entering the main facility. Inside, dozens of scientists worked frantically at advanced equipment, monitoring the spreading temporal anomalies across the valley. Large screens showed the affected areas growing slowly but steadily. "This way," the lead scientist directed, leading them to a heavily reinforced laboratory at the center of the facility. "The containment chamber is prepped and ready." The chamber resembled a bank vault combined with a particle accelerator, all gleaming metal and pulsing energy fields. In the center stood a platform designed to hold the device. "Once it's inside, we can neutralize the temporal displacement field," she explained. "But there's a risk. The backlash could affect anyone who's already been exposed to the field's effects." She looked pointedly at Martin. "You said you experienced a temporal reset before, that you lived through these events twice." Martin nodded. "The device activated in the forest. There was an energy wave, and then I woke up back at my farm at the moment the tanks arrived." "That's significant," she said thoughtfully. "You've been marked by the field. There's a chance that when we neutralize it, I might experience another reset," Martin finished for her. She nodded. "Or worse, your personal timeline might become untethered. We simply don't know." Elena gripped Martin's hand tightly. "There has to be another way." "I'm afraid not," Daniel said solemnly. "The device must be neutralized or the temporal fractures will continue to spread. Eventually, they could encompass the entire region, possibly the world." Martin took a deep breath. "Then do what you have to do. I made my choice when I decided to help Daniel. I'll live with the consequences." The scientists began the final preparations, carefully transferring the device from its case to the containment platform. Its blue light now pulsed erratically, and the high-pitched whine had returned, louder than before. 30 seconds to neutralization, a technician announced. Martin turned to Elena, memorizing every detail of her face. If something happens to me, if I reset again or disappear, know that I don't regret any of it. Helping Daniel was the right thing to do. I'm coming after you, Elena vowed, tears in her eyes. Whatever happens, I'll find you. Temporal field destabilizing, a scientist shouted. Containment is failing. The blue light from the device suddenly intensified, flooding the chamber. The high-pitched whine became deafening. Manual override required, the lead scientist called out. Someone needs to activate the final sequence from inside the containment field. Daniel stepped forward without hesitation. I created this. I'll end it. Before anyone could stop him, he rushed to the platform and began inputting commands on the control panel beside the device. The blue light enveloped him completely. Daniel, Martin shouted, stepping toward him, but Elena held him back. 20 seconds to critical failure, a technician warned. Daniel's voice came through the blue light, strangely calm. It's working. The field is collapsing inward. It will implode rather than expand. Through the brilliant blue glow, Martin could see Daniel smiling. Remember me, he called out. Remember what happened here. Some technology isn't meant to exist, not yet, maybe not ever. 10 seconds. Martin, Daniel's voice had become ethereal, as if coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. You were right to help me. Thank you for giving me the chance to fix my mistake. 5 seconds. Elena, Martin turned to his wife, holding her tightly. Whatever happens. The world exploded into blue light. Martin felt the same sensation he'd experienced in the forest, burning heat, followed by icy cold, then nothing at all. The universe seemed to contract to a single point, then expand again in an instant. And then silence. Martin opened his eyes to morning sunlight streaming through his bedroom window. For a moment, he lay perfectly still, trying to orient himself. Was this another reset? Had he traveled back in time again? He sat up slowly, surveying the familiar room. No tanks outside, no sounds of battle, just the normal morning noises of his farm, birds singing, livestock stirring in the barn. Elena stirred beside him, opening her eyes. Martin, what's wrong? What day is it? He asked urgently. She frowned, concerned. Sunday, the same as yesterday. Not a reset then, but had any of it happened at all? Had it all been a dream? Martin got out of bed and went to the window. His farm looked exactly as it always had, fields ready for spring planting, trees beginning to bud, the old barn standing solid against the morning sky. Martin, you're scaring me, Elena said, coming to stand beside him. What's going on? He was about to answer when he noticed something on the dresser, a small book he didn't recognize. He picked it up carefully. The cover was blank, but when he opened it, he found a handwritten note on the first page. Martin and Elena asterisk. If you're reading this, then the containment worked. The device has been neutralized and the temporal fractures have been repaired. History has been restored to its proper flow, with one exception. Your memories remain intact. Consider it a gift or perhaps a burden, depending on how you choose to view it. The war ended while you were in temporal suspension. 3 years have passed for the rest of the world, though for you it will seem like only a day. Both sides eventually realized that pursuing technologies like the quantum cipher key would lead to mutual destruction. Your farm has been preserved exactly as you left it. Consider it a small token of appreciation for your part in preventing what might have been a catastrophic escalation. As for me, the containment process didn't exactly kill me, but I no longer exist in the conventional sense. The temporal energy dispersed my physical form across multiple timeframes. In a way, I'm everywhere and everyone. It's not an unpleasant existence. Live well, remember what happened, and if anyone ever asks you to hide a soldier with a mysterious device, well, perhaps suggest they try the next farm over. With eternal gratitude, *. Daniel Fletcher. Martin handed the note to Elena, watching as she read it with growing amazement. It was real, she whispered, all of it. Martin nodded, looking out over his peaceful farm, and somehow we made it through. They stood together at the window, watching the sun rise over a world that had nearly been torn apart by temporal fractures. A disaster no one would ever know had been averted. What do we do now? Elena asked after a long silence. Martin took her hand, feeling truly at peace for the first time in what was apparently 3 years. We live, he said simply. We tend our farm, we remember. Outside, the world continued its orderly progression through time, second by second, minute by minute, day by day, just as it should. If you enjoyed this story of courage, sacrifice, and the unexpected consequences of helping a stranger, please like and subscribe for more compelling tales that explore the moral complexities of ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances. Comment below with your thoughts. Would you have helped Daniel if you were in Martin's position?